As many scary stories as I have written, I've never told any of the true ones that have helped to inspire the chills and the thrills I've written about here on this platform. To start off with, I've always known there was something just off in the cosmos the day I was born. I was literally born on Friday the 13th at 1:57 p.m. Now, that's strange enough, but what I'm about to relate to you is just as strange. They do say truth is stranger than fiction, and how right they are. I've always felt like I was cursed in some way because of this. Or maybe I was lucky, I have no idea. I once went to a psychic who told me I was marked, whatever the hell that means. I come from a long line of interesting women on my mother's side of the family. There is a story about my great-grandmother, who was Cherokee Indian, and she had weird dreams and visions. My mother was divorced from her first husband, and my two older siblings had to go to Florida to see them by plane. It was the late 70s, and a few years before I was born. My great-grandmother, who was staying with my mum at the time, woke her at 4 a.m. to tell her not to let Robbie, my brother who was 4 at the time, get on the plane. She insisted he was going to get severely hurt in some way, and that she had dreamt it. My mum has always been a realist and didn't believe my grandmother, yet it unnerved her just the same. It was court-ordered that she put him on the plane, and so she did. A few hours later, she got a call from her ex-husband that my brother and sister had made it to Florida, but he wanted to let her know his father had died that morning, and he had the same name as my brother. My stories are just as strange, but 3 things stand out in my life, beginning when I was about 4 years old. My father used to belong to a bowling league in the early 80s, and when he had things to do, he would let me hang out with an older man that was basically like everyone's grandpa at the bowling alley. His name was Ike, and he was the sweetest man on earth. He would let me eat free food, make me milkshakes, and let me play games without charging my dad for them. He was probably close to being 80 years old or so back then. One evening, my family was eating at the dinner table. My brother, sister, my mom and my dad, just sitting in our breakfast nook area eating, when the telephone rang. I don't recall who was on the phone, but I was eating my food and my dad whispered to my mom, "Who is it? Tell him you'll call them back, we're eating dinner." My mom ignored him, and I looked down at my plate of food and ever so matter-of-fact said, "Ike died." My dad looked at me sternly and told me to be quiet and eat my dinner. When my mom got off the phone, she was very sad-looking and looked at my dad. "You're never going to believe this, but Ike passed away this morning of a heart attack." My dad didn't even look at me, and I said, "I told you that. I already knew." I rolled my eyes and went back to eating. My dad and mom exchanged looks, and my older sister just stared at me in complete disbelief. My brother shook his head at me and told me I was a little weirdo. Well, I guess I was a little weirdo. I can't explain it to this day. How I knew it just popped into my head, and I knew he had died. I was more excited about knowing something that all the adults didn't know, because I was the baby of the family, and no one really paid much attention to the stuff that I told them. Years later, my sister recalled it, and relayed to me how creeped out she'd been by it. I also recalled later that night, waking up as though something had purposely wakened me, and looking out my bedroom window. There was a silhouette of a man watching me from the shadows outside. There were 3 duplexes just behind the house I grew up in, and an alley that led to a parking lot between each of them. I could see it very clearly from my second-story bedroom window. It was pitch black in my room, but I noticed a shadowy figure just standing there in the night, looking up at my window. I couldn't make out the face, but I knew it was a man. I have no idea if it was connected in any way to Ike's passing, but it scared me. I recall jumping back in my bed and trying to go back to sleep. There was something unnatural about it, and the fact he seemed to be looking at me creeped me out even more. Like, how did he see me? I knew he was watching me. It only happened that once, and I later forgot about it. Well, about 15 years later, a similar incident happened to me when I was 19 and in college. I'd been best friends with a boy named Brian when I was a kid, who lived down the street from me. His mom and my mum were good friends, and my mother would drive he, his younger brother, and myself to school every morning. We hung out a lot outside of school, and the three of us were inseparable. We were always on our bikes in the summer, or we went swimming in my backyard. I can't remember any part of my life from the age of 5 until I was about 10 that Brian wasn't around me. Then, one afternoon, my mum sat me down to tell me that Brian and his family were moving to Florida. I was obviously devastated at that fact, and it took a while for me to adjust to the fact I no longer had a best friend. Eventually, I moved on and made other close friends, but never as close as him. Around my senior year of high school, I was doing homework in my bedroom when my older sister, who was staying with my parents and I during her husband's deployment, came knocking on my bedroom door. I was annoyed, and then she said to me, "You're never gonna believe who's downstairs." I didn't know, I said, and then she told me Brian was on the front porch. It had been years since I'd seen or heard from him. When I found him, he was smoking a cigarette on our front porch and stood up, threw the cigarette in the front yard, and gave me the biggest hug of my life. We chatted for hours about he wished his family had never moved away. Things had changed for his family a lot after the move, and his parents soon split up. He told me how much he missed me, and how I was always his best friend. I recall thinking he was cute, but that he was a bad boy. He was driving this car that his uncle had given him with no driver's license. I was sad when he left, and he promised he would keep in touch. He did keep in touch, but his life was so far off track from mine. I knew he had anger issues and some drug problems. He called me one night to see if I would come hang out with him, but I'd already made plans with a friend of mine. When I asked if we could do it another time, he got mad and started going off on me over the phone about how all he wanted to do was just be my friend, and he knew I was just blowing him off. That was the last conversation I had with him over the phone. I'd tried to reach him after that, to try and talk to him and see how he was, but he didn't want to talk to me. Eventually, I moved past it. I graduated high school and went to a local liberal arts college about an hour from home. I'd been studying for my psych test that I needed to pass. I felt that going home for the weekend would give me the peace and quiet that I needed to brush up on my studies and do well enough on the test to get my grade up from the C that I had currently. My mom knocked on the door of my bedroom, and she had tears in her eyes. I looked at her as she held a newspaper in her hand. I sat up on my bed and looked at her. "What's wrong?" "You are never gonna guess who died." Again, something hit me, and I had no idea how I knew, but I knew. "Brian," I said to her. It had been almost 3 years since I'd seen him or given him any thought. Yet in that moment, I knew it was he who had passed away. "How did you know?" she asked me. "I don't know, Mum. I just did." She looked at me, and I began to tear up. "How do you think he died? There must have been a car accident or something," she said. "He killed himself," I told her, matter of fact. "How would you know that?" "I don't know. I just do." There was this foggy feeling I had, and I can't explain it. It just so happened my mum, who was in the habit of reading the obituaries, saw it, and it was the same day as the funeral. When we got to the funeral, his mum, obviously devastated, told my mum she'd found him hanging from a rafter in the basement of their house. It was 2 weeks before Christmas. The last thing I've experienced was when my dad became ill. When my father was 9 years old, he was hit by a car and his leg was severed from the shin down. Because of the quickness of the doctor and his age, they were able to save his leg, as it was still partially connected by about 1 inch of bone and skin. He remained in a full body cast for an entire year after. My father had a bit of a rough life, and around that time his own parents had begun to have issues. My grandfather left my grandmother and moved to Virginia. My dad, one of 6 brothers and sisters, became the primary breadwinner for his family when he was old enough to work. He worked hard, and he played hard. When he was 39 years old, he had a double hip replacement. The car accident he was in at 9 left one of his legs slightly longer than the other. It wasn't noticeable unless you stared at it. That hip replacement led to 3 more surgeries in the right hip, mainly due to a staph infection that kept coming back. He had a ton of close calls his entire life. My dad and I were always close. We were a lot alike, to be honest. We both require a lot of alone time to think and rest from the world. I think I get that from him as well as my wicked sense of humor. He was a truck driver for nearly 30 years, and I was taught the importance of working hard, and it's one of the reasons that I've been with the same employer for nearly 20 years. My father had to have his 4th surgery in January of 2009. He never asked me to be there for any of his surgeries, and this time he asked me, and only me, to drive him to the hospital. It was something about how my mum drove him crazy, with her worrying over him. I was very freaked out, because the night before I'd dreamt he didn't make it through the surgery. In the dream I'd seen him walking in the cemetery, and I couldn't reach him to find out what happened. I woke with tears streaming down my face, and I was filled with this sense of dread. Not to mention, he'd insisted on me driving him to the hospital. He had insisted on me driving him to the hospital. I was very scared, and it wasn't like him. But he made it through the surgery just fine, and I felt a lot better. I chalked it up to my worrying and paranoia. He was sent to recover in a rehabilitation clinic, and one evening, about 4 weeks later, my boyfriend and I went with my mum to visit him. He was looking a little depressed, and insisted we come back the next day to visit again when he was feeling better. I hugged him goodbye, and that was the last I saw of him. Sometime that night, he suffered from a blood clot, and my dad, the stubborn man he was, died getting up from a chair on his own to move to his own bed. He fell on the ground and died. The strangest part of it all was when my mum called me. I was in the shower and missed the call, but she got a hold of my brother, who lives in Arizona, and when he called me, I knew. I didn't even know my mum had tried to call me. The fact that my brother never calls me because he prefers to text was a sign that something was wrong. But again, I had that weird, foggy feeling come over me. It's like the world stops and you can see everything so clearly. I could smell my father everywhere that night too. It was as if he was hovering around me. Or maybe it was my mind playing tricks on my nose. It doesn't end there, though. Later that same night, when I finally fell asleep, I had another dream. I saw my dad, and the only thing he said to me was, "I tried. I'm sorry. And I love you too much, baby girl." I think this was because my dad had tried for years to overcome all the physical pain and all the surgeries he'd went through. It wore on him physically and emotionally. Well, I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I'm sharing these stories anyway. I can't explain knowing about Ike, Brian, or the dreams about my dad's passing. Maybe it was instinct or something warning me to prepare me. Maybe it gives way to something like hope or understanding. Not everything that goes bump in the night is bad, and some of us, for whatever reason, have these preternatural experiences we can't explain. I for sure can't explain away any of this.